You don't have a discipline problem. You don't have a motivation problem. You have a thinking problem. You've turned self-improvement into some bloated, over-engineered circus because it makes you feel intelligent without actually doing anything hard. You watch 40-minute videos, read 10 books, track 15 habits, and still wake up the same weak version of yourself. Why? Because complexity is your hiding place. You're not confused, you're avoiding reality. And the reality is simple. You either execute or you stay average. Most people overcomplicate self-improvement because simplicity exposes them. If I strip it down for you, wake up, train, work, repeat. You got nowhere to hide. No fancy system, no aesthetic routine, no productivity app to blame. Just you and your lack of discipline. So you invent layers. You start optimizing instead of doing. You become a collector of ideas instead of a builder of results. And deep down, you know it. That's why you keep searching, because if you stop searching, you'd have to start acting. Now let's talk about something most people are too soft to even understand: speaking in tongues. Not in a religious sense. I'm talking about the language you use inside your own head. The raw, unfiltered dialogue that defines who you are when nobody's watching. Weak men speak in hesitation, in excuses, in maybe tomorrow, and I'll try. That's their tongue. That's their identity. And it leaks into everything they touch. Powerful men, they speak a different language entirely. Their inner voice is sharp, direct, and non-negotiable. No stuttering, no debate. When they say something internally, it's law. I trained today, not a question. I finished this work, not optional. That's what speaking in tongues really is. It's rewriting your internal language until it commands obedience from your own mind. You don't rise to your goals. You fall to the level of your self-talk. Here's the truth you don't want to hear. Your current tongue is soft. It negotiates with weakness. It bargains with laziness. That's why you keep losing. You're trying to build discipline on top of a weak identity. That's like putting armor on a coward. It doesn't make him brave. It just makes him a heavier coward. Until your internal language becomes ruthless, your results will stay pathetic. Discipline isn't complicated. Control isn't complicated. Identity shift isn't complicated. What's complicated is your refusal to kill the weak version of yourself. You want transformation without destruction. Doesn't work. You have to burn the old language, the old excuses, the old patterns. Replace them with commands, with certainty, with dominance. Every thought becomes an order. Every action becomes execution. You don't have a time problem, and you definitely don't have an information problem. What you have is an addiction to complexity, because complexity gives you the illusion of progress without forcing you to face your own lack of execution. It feels productive to design the perfect routine, to research the best strategy, to fine-tune every detail, but none of that demands courage. It doesn't require you to confront discomfort, resistance, or failure. It keeps you safe, and that's exactly why you keep doing it. Look at your behavior honestly. You spend hours consuming content about improvement, but when it's time to act, you hesitate. You delay. You suddenly need more clarity, more certainty, more preparation. That's not intelligence, that's avoidance dressed up as discipline. You're building a mental maze so you never have to step onto the battlefield. Because the moment things become simple, wake up early, train hard, work with focus, you lose your escape route. There's nowhere left to hide except behind your own excuses. Complexity gives you something dangerous, plausible deniability. If your system is complicated enough, you can always blame the system when things go wrong. You can tweak it, adjust it, redesign it, and convince yourself you're still moving forward. But the truth is, brutal, none of that matters if you're not executing consistently. A simple plan executed daily will destroy a perfect plan that lives only in your head. Yet most people choose the perfect plan because it protects their ego from the reality of underperformance. There's also a deeper issue here: control. When you overcomplicate everything, you feel like you're in control because you're constantly analyzing, refining, and thinking. But real control isn't about thinking more. It's about doing more with less hesitation. The man who can act decisively on a simple objective has more power than the man who understands 10 different strategies but commits to none. You're chasing control through complexity, when real control comes from disciplined action. Another uncomfortable truth is that complexity makes you feel superior. It allows you to believe you're operating on a higher level than others. You start using advanced terminology, building intricate systems, and convincing yourself you're different. But results don't care about how sophisticated your process looks. Results respond to consistency, effort, and execution. The simplest path, repeated relentlessly, will outperform the most advanced system abandoned halfway. And here's where it gets even more brutal. Every layer of complexity you add increases the chances of failure. More steps mean more opportunities to break. More rules mean more ways to justify stopping. You think you're building structure, but you're actually building friction. The moment your system becomes difficult to follow, your brain starts looking for reasons to quit. Simplicity removes that friction. It forces you into action whether you feel like it or not. You don't need another framework. You don't need another method. You need to strip everything down until there's nothing left but action. Wake up when you said you would. Do the work you plan. Finish what you started. Repeat it without negotiation. It's brutally simple, and that's exactly why it's effective. But simplicity is uncomfortable because it exposes the truth. If you're not progressing, it's not because you're confused. It's because you're not doing the work. The longer you stay attached to complexity, the longer you delay your own growth. You keep telling yourself you're preparing, but preparation without execution is just procrastination with better branding. The gap between where you are and where you want to be isn't filled with more knowledge. It's filled with repeated, disciplined action. Strip away the noise, and what's left is the only thing that ever mattered. There's a voice in your head that never stops talking, and whether you admit it or not, that voice is running your life. Every decision, every hesitation, every missed opportunity, it all traces back to the language you use internally. You can pretend your problem is discipline or consistency, but if your internal dialogue is weak, your actions will always follow. You don't act against your inner voice, you obey it. Pay attention to how you speak to yourself when things get difficult. The moment pressure shows up, your tone shifts. It becomes uncertain, cautious, filled with hesitation. Maybe I'll do it later. I'm not ready yet. I'll start when things are better. That's not harmless thinking, that's programming. And you've been repeating that script so many times that it feels natural. But what feels natural isn't always useful. In your case, it's destructive. Weak internal language creates fragile behavior. If your mind is constantly negotiating with discomfort, you'll never build the capacity to handle it. Every challenge becomes optional. Every commitment becomes flexible. You start believing that effort is something you give only when it feels convenient. And the worst part is, you don't even notice it happening. It becomes your default state, your automatic response to pressure. Now compare that to someone whose internal voice operates with authority. There's no debate, no emotional back and forth. When a decision is made internally, it's final. The language is direct, controlled, and precise. This gets done. Not I'll try, not I hope. There's a level of certainty that eliminates hesitation before it even begins. That's not arrogance. It's alignment between thought and action. And that alignment is where real power comes from. You might think this is just mindset theory, something abstract that doesn't affect real results. That's another mistake. Your internal language directly shapes your behavior patterns. If your thoughts are inconsistent, your actions will be inconsistent. If your thoughts are hesitant, your actions will be delayed. You don't suddenly become decisive in the real world if your mind is full of uncertainty. The outside world is just a reflection of what's happening inside. Another layer most people ignore is how quickly this internal voice influences your identity. The way you talk to yourself today becomes who you believe you are tomorrow. If your internal dialogue constantly reinforces doubt, you start identifying as someone who struggles, someone who hesitates, someone who falls short. That identity then dictates your future actions, creating a loop that's difficult to break. You're not just thinking weak thoughts, you're becoming the person those thoughts describe. And here's the part that most people avoid. Changing this isn't comfortable. You can't casually improve your internal language while still entertaining weak thoughts. It requires conscious control. You have to interrupt the patterns, replace the hesitation, and enforce a different standard of thinking. That means catching yourself in moments of doubt and correcting it immediately. Not later, not when it's convenient, on the spot. There's also no middle ground here. You either control your internal voice or it controls you. And right now, if you're honest, it's controlling you more than you'd like to admit. It dictates when you stop, when you slow down, when you give up. It tells you what you can and can't handle, and you listen without question. That's not awareness, that's submission. Once you start shifting that language, everything changes. Decisions become faster. Actions become sharper. You stop wasting energy on internal debates and start directing it toward execution. The noise fades, and what's left is clarity. But that clarity doesn't come from reading more or learning more. It comes from taking control of the one thing you've been ignoring. the voice that's been shaping your reality all along. You keep treating discipline like it's some clever strategy you need to design, refine, and optimize. That's the mistake. Discipline is not a system you build, it's a standard you obey. The moment you turn it into a strategy, you give yourself permission to adjust it, negotiate it, and eventually abandon it. And that's exactly what you've been doing. You don't lack discipline because you haven't found the right method. You lack discipline because you haven't decided that your own words are final. Look at how you approach commitments. You set intentions, you make plans, you even feel motivated in the beginning. But the second discomfort shows up, everything becomes flexible. Suddenly, there's room for delay, for excuses, for just this once. That's not a failure of planning. That's a failure of obedience. You're not following through because deep down you don't respect your own commands. And if you don't respect your own commands, nothing else in your life will hold structure. Discipline at its core is simple to understand and brutal to execute. It means when you decide something, it happens regardless of mood, energy, or external circumstances. Not because it's easy, not because you feel like it, but because you said so. That level of internal authority is what separates people who produce results from those who stay stuck in cycles of inconsistency. It's not talent, it's not intelligence, it's the ability to act without negotiation. Most people are addicted to negotiation. Every task becomes a conversation. Should I do this now or later? Maybe I can skip today and double tomorrow. I'm not at my best, so I'll wait. That constant internal dialogue weakens your execution. It creates friction where there should be none. High-performing individuals don't eliminate difficulty, they eliminate the option to debate it. The task is already decided. The only variable left is how quickly it gets done. You've been taught to believe that discipline is about finding motivation or building habits slowly over time. That's incomplete. Habits can help, but they don't replace authority. If your internal standard is weak, your habits will collapse the moment pressure increases. Real discipline doesn't rely on conditions being favorable. It operates regardless of them. It's the ability to function at a high level even when everything in you wants to stop. There's also a hard truth: most people avoid discipline requires a level of self-respect that many haven't built. When you repeatedly break your own promises, you train your mind to see your words as optional. Over time, that erodes trust in yourself. You start doubting your own commitments before you even begin. And once that trust is gone, every new goal feels heavier, harder, and less believable. You're not just failing tasks, you're weakening your own foundation. Rebuilding that foundation isn't complicated, but it's uncomfortable. It starts with making smaller, clear decisions and executing them without exception. Not because they're significant, but because they rebuild the connection between what you say and what you do. Each time you follow through, you reinforce authority. Each time you hesitate, you weaken it. There's no neutral ground here. You're either strengthening your discipline or eroding it. Another mistake is waiting to feel ready. Readiness is irrelevant. Discipline doesn't ask for your emotional state, it overrides it. The moment you start relying on how you feel, you introduce inconsistency. Some days you'll feel strong, other days you won't. If your actions depend on that, your results will fluctuate. But when discipline is rooted in obedience, your output becomes stable. You act because it's required, not because it's required. At a higher level, discipline becomes identity. It's no longer something you try to do, it's how you operate. Decisions become faster because there's no internal conflict. You don't waste energy debating tasks you've already committed to. That energy gets redirected into execution, precision, and improvement. And that's where real progress accelerates. Not through more planning, but through consistent, decisive action backed by absolute internal authority. You're trying to produce outcomes that don't match who you are, and then you act surprised when it doesn't work. That disconnect is the reason you keep stalling. You're chasing results like discipline, focus, and control, but your identity is still wired for comfort, distraction, and inconsistency. You're attempting to perform at a level your internal standards don't support. That's not ambition, that's contradiction. Pay attention to how you define yourself when no one is listening. Not the version you present publicly, not the goals you claim to have, but the quiet, automatic labels you attach to your behavior. I'm not consistent. I struggle with focus. I start strong but fall off. Those statements might feel honest, but they're also instructions. Every time you repeat them, you reinforce a version of yourself that aligns with those outcomes. Then you try to act differently, and it collapses because your identity pulls you back to what feels familiar. Most people attack the surface. They try to fix actions without questioning the identity driving those actions. They force themselves into routines, push through for a few days, maybe even a few weeks, but eventually they revert, not because they lack willpower, but because they never change the foundation. If you still see yourself as someone who avoids discomfort, your mind will find a way to avoid it, even if you temporarily override it. Identity always wins in the long run. There's also a dangerous habit of borrowing identities. You watch someone disciplined, successful, controlled, and you try to copy their actions without adopting their standards. You mimic the routine, the schedule, the structure, but internally, nothing has shifted. It's performance without belief. And the moment things get difficult, the borrowed identity disappears because it was never truly yours. You can't sustain behavior that isn't backed by internal alignment. Real change starts when you stop asking, "What should I do?" and start asking, "Who am I becoming?" That shift forces you to confront something uncomfortable. You can't keep your current habits and expect a different identity. You have to make decisions that align with the version of yourself you claim to want. And those decisions won't feel natural at first. They'll feel forced, unnatural, even frustrating. That's the process of breaking an old identity that's been reinforced for years. You also need to understand that identity isn't built through words. It's built through repeated proof. You don't become disciplined by saying it once. You become disciplined by acting in alignment with that standard repeatedly, especially when it's inconvenient. Every action is a vote. Every decision either strengthens the identity you want or reinforces the one you're trying to leave behind. There's no in-between. You're either moving forward or staying locked in place. Another mistake is expecting immediate internal change. You think once you decide to become a different person, everything should feel aligned instantly. That's unrealistic. Your mind will resist because it's used to operating a certain way. The key is not waiting for that resistance to disappear. It's acting despite it. Over time, as your actions stay consistent, your identity begins to shift. The internal dialogue changes. The resistance weakens. But it only happens if you keep proving it through action. There's a level of responsibility here most people avoid. If your results are inconsistent, it's not because the method is flawed, it's because your identity isn't stable. You're trying to build results on top of a weak foundation. Fix the foundation, and everything else becomes easier. Ignore it, and you'll keep cycling through the same patterns, blaming circumstances, strategies, or timing. At a higher level, identity becomes the filter for every decision you make. You don't waste time debating actions because they're already aligned with who you are. A disciplined person doesn't argue with discipline. It's automatic. A focused person doesn't negotiate with distraction. They eliminate it. When your identity is clear, your behavior follows without friction. That's where consistency stops being a struggle and becomes a standard you operate by. You keep telling yourself you're being smart by analyzing everything before you act. You call it preparation, you call it strategy, you call it being thorough. But if you strip away the labels, what's left is hesitation. And hesitation, repeated often enough, becomes a pattern. That pattern is not intelligence, it's fear, wearing a suit so it looks respectable. Watch what happens the moment a real decision appears in front of you. Something that actually matters, something that requires commitment. Instead of moving, you pause. You start weighing options, imagining outcomes, predicting risks. On the surface, it looks responsible. Underneath, it's avoidance. Because as long as you're thinking, you don't have to face the possibility of failure. Thinking feels safe. Action doesn't. Overthinking gives you the illusion of control. It makes you believe that if you just consider every angle, you can eliminate uncertainty. But uncertainty is not something you remove, it's something you move through. The more you try to control it from a distance, the more stuck you become. You end up circling the same ideas, refining the same plans without ever stepping forward. That loop feels productive, but it produces nothing. There's also a hidden comfort in staying in analysis mode. It keeps your identity intact. As long as you haven't acted, you can still believe you're capable of anything. Your potential remains untouched, untested, perfect in theory. The moment you act, that illusion is gone. Now there's a result. Now there's feedback. And that feedback might not match the image you've built in your head. So you delay, because delay protects your ego. Another layer most people ignore is how overthinking drains your energy. Every decision you replay, every scenario you imagine, consumes mental resources. By the time you're ready to act, you're already exhausted. You've lived the situation 10 times in your head without ever engaging with reality. That fatigue lowers your confidence, slows your response, and reinforces the idea that the task is harder than it actually is. You've probably noticed this pattern before. The longer you think about something, the bigger it feels. Small tasks turn into major challenges. Simple actions start to look complicated. That's not because the task changed, it's because your perception did. Overthinking magnifies difficulty. It stretches a moment of action into hours or days of hesitation, making the entire process feel heavier than it needs to be. There's also a critical distinction you need to understand. Thinking is valuable when it leads to a decision. Overthinking is what happens when thinking replaces decision. One moves you forward, the other keeps you stuck. If you're constantly gathering more information without reaching a point of commitment, you're not learning, you're avoiding. Real clarity comes after action, not before it. Fear plays a central role here, whether you admit it or not. Fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of making the wrong move. Instead of confronting that fear directly, you try to outthink it. You convince yourself that one more piece of information will make you feel ready. But readiness doesn't come from thinking more, it comes from acting despite uncertainty. Every time you delay, you reinforce the idea that fear should be obeyed. The shift happens when you stop treating every decision like it needs perfect conditions. Most decisions don't require perfection. They require movement. You gather enough information to be directionally correct, and then you act. You adjust based on feedback. That's how progress actually works. Not through endless analysis, but through cycles of action and correction. Once you start operating this way, something changes. The weight of decisions decreases. The pressure to be perfect disappears. You realize that most of the scenarios you feared never even happen, and the ones that do are manageable. But that realization only comes after you break the pattern. As long as you stay in your head, fear stays in control, quietly dictating your pace while convincing you that you're being careful. At some point, you have to confront a simple, uncomfortable fact: nothing you know matters if it doesn't translate into action. You can understand every principle, memorize every strategy, and still remain exactly where you are. Knowledge has no value on its own. It only becomes valuable when it's applied with consistency. Until then, it's just stored potential, and stored potential doesn't change your life. You've been conditioned to believe that learning is progress. It feels productive to consume information, to expand your understanding, to refine your ideas. But there's a clear line between learning and executing, and most people never cross it. They stay in a constant state of preparation, convincing themselves they're moving forward while their reality stays the same. The truth is, direct execution is the only proof that anything you've learned actually works. There's also a harsh reality about how the world evaluates you. It doesn't care about your intentions, your plans, or your knowledge. It responds to results. You can explain your process, justify your delays, and outline your strategy in perfect detail. But none of that creates impact. Impact comes from what gets done, not from what could have been done. And until you accept that standard, you keep measuring yourself by the wrong metrics. Execution has a quality that thinking doesn't. It creates feedback. The moment you act, you get a result. That result might not be perfect, but it gives you something real to work with. It shows you what needs to improve, what needs to change, what actually works. Without execution, you're operating in theory. And theory, no matter how refined, can't replace real-world feedback. Another reason execution is so critical is because it builds momentum. Action leads to more action. Once you start moving, the resistance decreases. The task that felt heavy becomes manageable. The uncertainty that held you back starts to fade. But momentum only exists after the first step. If you never act, you never experience that shift. You stay stuck at the starting point where everything feels harder than it actually is. There's also a discipline component that most people underestimate. Execution requires you to act even when conditions aren't ideal. You won't always feel ready. You won't always have clarity. You won't always have motivation. If you wait for those things, your output will be inconsistent. The ability to execute regardless of internal or external conditions is what creates stability in your performance. You've probably noticed how easy it is to delay action with reasonable excuses. You tell yourself you need more time, better conditions, or a clearer plan. And those reasons sound valid in the moment. But when you look back, they all lead to the same outcome: nothing gets done. Execution cuts through all of that. It removes the space where excuses live. When you act immediately, there's no time to negotiate, no room to rationalize delay. There's also a shift in identity that comes with consistent execution. You stop seeing yourself as someone who plans or thinks, and you start seeing yourself as someone who produces results. That shift changes how you approach everything. You don't spend as much time debating decisions because your default response is to act. That reduces friction, increases efficiency, and builds confidence based on real outcomes, not assumptions. The gap between where you are and where you want to be is not filled with more information. It's filled with repeated execution. Every action moves you forward, even if it's imperfect. Every delay keeps you exactly where you are. Once you understand that, your priorities change. You stop chasing knowledge for the sake of it, and you start applying what you already know. That's where progress becomes visible, measurable, and undeniable. Stop trying to understand self-improvement. That's the trap. This isn't philosophy. This is war. And in war, the man with the clearest commands wins. Not the smartest, not the most informed, the most decisive, the most controlled, the one whose inner voice doesn't crack under pressure. So here's your reality check. You don't need another system. You need a new tongue, a new internal voice that doesn't tolerate weakness, delay, or doubt. Until you build that, you'll keep spinning in circles, calling it growth, while staying exactly where you are. Decide who speaks inside your head, because right now, it's not a winner. And until that changes, neither will your life.